That sounds like the song when they said that government. Anyway, the after school special. That's what that sounds like. That's what that sounds like. It's throwback from the '60s. So if you don't have a handout, they're back on the table. Julia, you get yours. Word. All right. Roman numeral 6. Roman numeral 6. Remember, where does good come from? We call that moral ontology. In normal person parlance, we sometimes call that the grounding issue. It's grounded in what? So there are about 4 or 5 major answers in philosophy, moral philosophy, of where does it come from in moral ontology. Some say it comes from the scientific method itself, science, and that's letter A. I don't find that persuasive, and I think most don't. But what scientific apparatus would you use to tell me what I ought to do? That doesn't make any sense to me. There's B, well, it comes from naturalism itself. That is, it comes from the laws of physics and energy. I explained how that's, to me, very unpersuasive. Several reasons why, like you can't get an ought from it is. Um, then we talked about, well, it comes from evolutionary development through human, all the way to the human person. And then I gave responses to that by saying that seems, again, silly for multiple reasons. And then we got to letter D, and some say, well, moral values are grounded in what we call Platonism, that they are abstract objects. They're just timeless things, and we appeal to them. The typical response is, where do they come from, and how do they exist, and why do they have oughtness, and why should I obey abstract thing called honesty? Why should I do what this abstract? And a Platonist would probably say you're just supposed to. I mean, I'm not sure. I've never heard a really good answer to that, but I'm skipping over the stuff. You can read Christian Platonists who say, no, that's the best explanation. They're a minority, but they're there. And then the last one we introduced last time was letter E, divine command theory. And before I say any question or comments about what I've covered so far, the scientific method, evolution, naturalism, any questions, comments about that? So in divine command theory is the theory that says, that looks basically at what's good and bad, what's grounded in God. Okay, so in essence, it comes down to 2 different ways of understanding divine command theory. And that's Roman numeral 2. So values either come from his will, which is called voluntarism. It comes from voluntarism. Moral values are grounded in what he says do, or moral values are grounded in his character, called essentialism. And those are 2 major ways of understanding. So this is what I introduced last week. Voluntarists would say that it's good because God wills it. God wills it. An essentialist says, no, they're grounded in his very nature, or the essence of God. So what's morally good won't change because God's character doesn't change. Or if it's grounded in his will, that could conceivably change. And then I ended last week by saying, like Bill Craig, William Lane Craig, at least I find this the most persuasive view. He says, I see moral duties rooted in his commandments, moral values in the nature of God. So, for example, if it is good to be honest, so honesty is a moral value, moral value. If someone says, why is that a moral value? What is it grounded upon? What's the moral ontology? And then an essentialist would say, honesty is good because honesty comes from God's very character. His character, he's an honest God. That's where values come from. It's God's very character. He's purely honest. He never lies. We'll see, okay, so now telling the truth is a moral duty. Telling the truth. A duty, always used in English, an action verb, right? Giving to the poor or being generous, or that's a duty, right? A commandment. And essentialists would say, typically would say that, and our duties, what we ought to do, come from his commandments. When he says, go do this, go do this. Okay, so far so good or not? What was that? Yay. Okay, no, really, feel free to, any questions about that? And it's a quick review from last week. If you weren't here last week, then it's a super fast review. Any questions about that? So one more time. So that's my, it doesn't have to be your view, but my view is exactly, I'm going to send exactly what Bill Craig said. I do find that the most persuasive view. Okay. Okay, so this next part you might not care about, and that's fine. If you talk to a semi-educated atheist or non-Christian, they will always bring up the next thing called the Euthyphro dilemma. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that because it will always be brought up. They'll say, oh, you think in moral values from his character, his duty, and there's a real problem here. Okay, so real quickly, what in the world are we talking about? So, and I put a bunch of words on the screen. I know you may not be able to read, but I did on purpose just to read it. You don't have to memorize all this, but what am I talking about when I say Plato's Euthyphro? Euthyphro is one of Plato's early dialogues, a pretend dialogue, about early 4th century BC. This is a long time ago. He wrote these pretend stories, pretend dialogue. And one of the stories is called Euthyphro. And in this Euthyphro, it's centering on an imaginary conversation between Socrates and a man named Euthyphro outside the Athenian courthouse. As the dialogue begins, Socrates is about to be prosecuted for impiety. Sometimes that's the Latin. The Greek might be ungodliness. And corrupting the youth of Athens. Socrates is in trouble. He encounters Euthyphro, who's also at the courthouse. But Euthyphro is there to prosecute his own dad for the murder of a laborer. Surprised by Euthyphro's decision to prosecute a family member, Socrates inquires about the nature of piety. In Greek, we say eusebia. He wants to understand the reasoning behind Euthyphro's actions. What led you to do that? How could you turn in your dad? Now, a little footnote here. Piety can be defined as devotion and reverence toward a higher power or deity, usually through rituals. In the New Testament, it's not written in Latin, but in Greek, the Greek equivalent is eusebia, which is often translated godliness. Just let you know, a wink, wink, this isn't that. So you see that in 1 Timothy 2, 2 Timothy, 2 Peter 1, and I put those scripture verses. My point is you see this kind of stuff, and so we typically translate godliness. So what is it, godliness? So the dialogue, so Socrates is going, how could you set your dad up to prison or execution? Well, I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to be pious. I'm trying to do the right thing. So he goes, all right, what is the right thing? What is pious to this imaginary courthouse guy? So it's the dialogue is a bunch of attempts by Euthyphro goes, piety is blank. And Socrates has well, what about this? And he goes, okay. Then piety is really this. And, okay, what about this? So the first one, Euthyphro says, piety is doing what is good now. That is, you persecute wrongdoers regardless of your relationship. Even if it's your dad, you take him down. And Socrates has some responses, and he goes, okay, we don't like that definition. So then he goes, all right, how about Euthyphro amends it, and he says that piety is what is dear to the gods. Socrates doesn't buy that one fully. There's a third definition. Socrates points out that the gods often disagree among themselves. This brings up the question, if gods disagree on a matter, can the same action be both pious and impious? If they disagree, Euthyphro, well, okay, I'll change it this way. Piety is what the gods love. All the gods must love it. All right, at this point, Socrates introduces the central philosophical problem, and it's this. And it's called Euthyphro dilemma, because the guy's name is Euthyphro. He says, do the gods love certain actions because they're pious? That is, the actions are pious. Or are they pious because the gods love them? This problem, of course, challenges the idea that morality is based on divine command. Euthyphro gives a few more examples that it's a form of trading with the gods and on and on. But anyway, we're going to stop it. I won't keep going on. The dialogue ends inconclusively, to be continued, ... Socrates' way of saying, wink, wink, try to figure this out. It's a moral dilemma. And so he hurries off. Socrates faces a trial on his own. So the central dilemma is this, one more time. So the central dilemma is this. Is something a moral good because God wills it, or does God will it because it's good? If it's the first, it's good because God wills it. It makes morality seem arbitrary because God could will something different all the time. He could say, don't rape. You can rape. Don't steal. You can steal. If it's good, if the second, it means that it's good, he wills it because it is good. Well, who says? There must be something above God to which God is appealing, where he learns, this is good. Where'd you learn that, God? It's something beyond me. But if that's true, then it doesn't tell me where morality comes from, something above God. It also doesn't at all fit the definition of what we mean by God, the highest, greatest conceivable being. So that's typically what an atheist will say in response. Yeah, I hear you grounding in God. Yeah, but there's Euthyphro's dilemma. Is it good because of God's will or because of blah, blah? So the dilemma is only a dilemma if you're a voluntarist, that things are good because God wills it. That's it. If you're an essentialist, there's no problem. So the divine essentialist would assert that God commands something because it is intrinsically good. God commands something because it's intrinsically good, because that's his nature. That's it. So there's no big dilemma. Why would God? Yeah, but if it's good because it's in God's character, right, but his character doesn't change. So it's inconceivable that he would ever command something ever that's bad or wrong or different. If God's very character is honest, that means he would never command to go lie. He would never command that because he's honest or whatever. He would never change. Okay. I'll pause. I hope that wasn't too fast, but hopefully you see the so-called dilemma. Any question or comments about that before we move on? Good. So what about when God, you said, killed off all those people because they were bad? So for example, the conquest, the Canaanite conquest in the Joshua and Judges, when he says, and the Old Testament says, go kill them. Is that what you're talking about? No, in the ark. Okay, what about that? Good. So God says don't murder, but he killed all those people. That's right. So a couple things. One is by the time he killed all those people, he hadn't commanded anybody don't murder. But two, I will answer more of that the very next thing. I will. But third, I would say is by the definition of both Hebrew and Greek, God did not murder. Yeah. But we'll talk about that here in just a second too. So a better analogy, if you could give one, is where you would say if God commands people do not commit child sacrifice to atone for sins, as other pagan Canaanites did, and then he told Israelites that's what you're supposed to do. And no, that's not what he said to Abraham. Everyone gets that wrong. That's not what he said. But anyway, that's not. So those would be something a bit different. So in general, an essentialist will say there's no dilemma. It's good because it comes from God's very character. So whatever he commands is a moral duty, but values are grounded in God's very being, which does not change. So that's the argument. That's the belief. You don't have to believe that. That is my belief, that something is good because it comes from God's very character. It's kind of like saying, where do the canons of logic come from? For example, the law of excluded middle. You can't have both A and non-A at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. I exist and I don't exist simultaneously. That's called gibberish. Oh no, it's true. That's what a Hindu would say. I've read part of the Vedas, their scripture, and that just, gibberish is gibberish. Even if you go, it sounds cool. It's just gibberish. You violated the law of non-contradiction. You can't be both A and non-A at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. That's called a contradiction. Contradiction is nonsense. Well, that's like that with God. Why is it nonsense? Because God is chiefly rational. Where do I get this idea of the canons of logic? Most philosophers say from God himself. God is essentially rational. Doesn't mean he can't feel things. My point is that's where reason comes from. Reason comes from him. So if you say there's no reason, so where do you ground the rules of logic? I would say God. Well, God can make a square circle? No. So he's not God. He's not powerful. Power has nothing to do with it. You said something that's gibberish. God also can't make a married bachelor. He's not God, is he? Yes. Dumb is dumb, regardless of the word God on it. It's irrational. That's nonsense. By definition, a bachelor is unmarried. You cannot make a married bachelor. You cannot make a rock so big you can't. That doesn't make any sense. It's gibberish. Where do you get this gibberish from? I would say from God himself. I think rationality comes from God. It's just the way it is. And I think it's never changed. I don't think it ever will change, ever. I see no reason to think it would change. I think the same thing about moral values. God cared a moral value is to love. That comes from God. God's very nature is as 1 John says, God is love. Not he hopes to be one day, not sometimes he's loving, but that moral value is just rooted in his very nature. That's just the way it is. If not, I'll move on. So there you go. If you ever come up with this again, if you are Youth of Rose Dilemma because you're dialoguing with your non-Christian friends, maybe go back to your handout if you don't remember. If not, whatever. Go ahead. Any questions, comments? Seriously, it's okay. This is... All right, good. This next one will set you free, Brandon. Can I get a hallelujah? Thank you. Thank you. So, where does good come from? Values come from God's character. God's duties come from his commandments. Okay, so this next thing is very, 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 very important. So much so I put very important. Does God have moral duties? When this hit me several years ago, I'm telling you, it was a big deal. You might not give a rip, but I sure did. Well, the answer is yes and no. When God issues duties to himself, like, I'll protect you, well, right, then he has a moral duty because he's God and he gives himself a commandment, you might say. He gives his word. But in general, the answer is no. God has no moral duties. God does not, I repeat, not have moral duties that humans have because there is no superior power to God to issue such a command. That is inconceivable. By definition, God is the greatest conceivable being. There's no one beyond God to tell him what to do. He has no moral duties. God can't commit a crime. He invented law. Nearly every single human I've ever met who's not educated in this field gets this wrong. God is not a human. God doesn't have human moral duties. He does not. Every single non-Christian I've ever heard in my life gets this wrong. And they're so angry. And it's another reason why in church you'll hardly ever say this ever. And I do some, but what I do, I nuance it every time. People go, God is our Father. He's our Father. And on a Father's Day, they go on and on and on. That is wrong to do that. There are features about God as Father, absolutely. Jesus calls him Father, yep, but it has to be nuanced. The problem is most people don't nuance it, so they think God has the same moral duties that a human father does. That is demonstrably false. Period. He's not a human father. Human fathers have moral duties. God does not have. How could he? Well, if God were good then, assumes God has violated some moral duty that he never had in the first place. How could he let that child die? Says who? What moral duty did he violate? How could he not save that person? Because why? Well, I would. I hope you would. Where do you get this sense you ought to? Well, because he gave it to you. God doesn't, he's not you. Now, before we do, just please let this sink in. And I've said this before, I'll keep saying it. I have 2 children. I am chiefly morally responsible for me and their mom are chiefly morally responsible for raising them. Not you. Not you. And if someone came up to my door and Bonnie came up, hi, and I go, hey, Bonnie, you go, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. What, Bonnie? What? I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't raise your kids. I should have. I should have. Now, Bonnie's so sweet, she'd do it anyway. Bonnie, Bonnie, I sad baby to my family. Baby, sweetie, dumpling. I didn't feed him. I should have. I should have fed him. What do you... Bonnie, are you okay? I should have. Bonnie, what's wrong with you? I just feel so awful. And she's crying. Come here, Bonnie. Come on. What? I can't believe I was so derelict. I just can't forgive myself. I shouldn't have. That would be cuckoo crazy. I'd say, Bonnie, they're my kids. What makes you think you had the moral duty to raise my children? Why would you think that? Because I just do. No, 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 Bonnie. No, no, Bonnie. I'm in the office of their parent. You're not in the office of parent. In the office of parent, I have more responsibilities that you do not. But see, we live the world that way all the time. When a police officer, hypothetically, pulls over Elaine, I mean, if I got pulled over, if I get pulled over and they go, you were speeding, how dare you? If Julia pulled me over, I would say, get back in the car. If Bonnie pulled me over, I'd say, what's up? David, you were speeding. I go, yeah, maybe I was a little bit. David, I'm going to give you a ticket. That's good. All right, I'll see you at church on Sunday. No, David. Bonnie, you're not in the office of police officer. You're not in that office. You do not have the moral authority to hold me accountable to moral duties you didn't write in the first place. You're not the legislative branch, the executive branch, judicial branch. You're none of those branches. You're a civilian like I am. You do not have the office of that. You have the moral responsibility. We do this all life, all the time. We all know that offices decide whether you have the moral authority to do something. God, in the office of God, doesn't report to anybody. He has no moral duties. He obeys no speeding laws. He obeys no rules because he's the only one who issues rules. He is the highest conceivable judge and reports to no one else. He reports to not. This will set people free. Now, you will hate, some, not you, because you're all faithful, Jesus-loving Christians, but people hate hearing what I'm about to say. He does not report to you. He doesn't report to you. How could he? Says who? You? I say that in my book I just wrote all over and over. Well, how could God? He doesn't. He needs to tell me exactly why these things happen, or I'm out of here. People do that. They're doing it right now all over the world. They're so mad at him. And you've heard me say 100 times, certainly in counseling, I absolutely understand. I have deep empathy for the pain and rage. I have felt the same kind of rage at God, and I get it. But the proper response to that is grief and counseling, not how could he. It puts you in this great moral superiority to God. He did something wrong. Says you? I mean, it just makes no sense. It feels good in the moment, right, because we're raging, and someone's got to be to blame. I remember very much being at a hospital floor. My family were at Cracker Barrel, and I got a call from one of our elders this is back when I was in Houston, Texas, and her son had just tried to kill himself. So we left Cracker Barrel. I fled to the hospital. By the time I got there, he had just died. And so it's just a family in this room, this waiting room, and they're just, of course, weeping, upset. When I came and sat on the ground with them, and the wife, and they're just, and one of the, of course, the very first question is, why would God do this? Which we had some talks about that. But of course, someone's got to be to blame, and it can't be my son. And that's standard, by the way, in grief and kind of that's standard. That's standard. So I don't go, hey, now, let's get out our Bibles. It's time for a theology lesson. That's not what I do, ever. The point is, we want to blame someone, and God had the moral responsibility to make sure my son would not hurt himself. Says who? Well, I would never let my son. Good. You shouldn't harm your son. Why would God murder all those people? God didn't murder anyone. God, in the office of God, has the authority to give life and take it all away instantaneously. Everything that exists, the universe, is God's property to do exactly what he wants to when he wants to do with it, including you and everything you cherish in life. That's mine, that's mine, that's mine. None of this stuff is yours. None of it's mine. No, my grandkids, no, they're not. No, they're not. You are nothing more than a steward with your children and your grandkids and your favorite Ford truck. Where is he at? Outside, there's a Ford in the front. That old? Oh, you're talking Lynn. Yeah, Lynn. The beautiful red old. That is, we're just stewards of it. We're just stewards of it. Well, David, does that mean I can't go to? Yes, go to God. But the anger, rage you experience toward him, that we do when we've experienced terrible loss, we can feel rage toward him, is a normal child ego state. I don't like it. And he needs to explain himself right now. I get it. It's just that morally, logically, that is absolutely incoherent. It's incoherent. He would have every right, and sometimes in his voice, still small voice, will say this. If you listen carefully, sometimes his voice is going to sound like these kind of words. I'm so very, very sorry. And I don't report to you. You need to explain yourself right now. I know you feel that way, but truth is, no, I don't. I don't need to do anything that I don't want to do. So the Christian, well, let me say it this way. So the non-Christian leaves that conversation giving him the bird, I'm out of here, this is the stupidest thing, stupid, anger rage. The Christian ends a different way. The Christian says this at the very end. The Christian says, I trust you. Not my will, but. So I put this in there on purpose because if you ever struggle with this, and you're going to meet non-Christians who struggle with this, if you've ever talked to a non-Christian who's ever been hurt in their life, who is still mad at God, I guarantee you at core they're mad because they're convinced God violated some moral rule or duty. My response, first off, is always counseling pastoral, but if they bring up theology, and I'll say, I hear you, and I'm so very, very sorry you're hurting. I mean it. But the assumption of your demand, the assumption of your challenge toward God is simply misplaced. God doesn't report to you. He does not have your moral. I would never do that. I know, and I hear you, and I'm so glad you wouldn't. But God doesn't have the same duty you do. Well, that just doesn't make any sense. Yes, it does, actually. We live this way in the real world all the time. We know instantly whether someone has a certain moral responsibility depending on their office. God in the office of God is the top dog. No one is above him. And he has the right to give, take, bless whenever he wants. I mean, just whenever he wants. Jesus tells John the Baptizer in Matthew 11, he says, and blessed is the one who's not offended at me. I just don't report to you, John. I know you're upset. I know you are. You're in prison. And you're my cousin. I'm talking about God setting us free. Other people are getting set free. Blind can see, the deaf can hear, dead are coming into your life. Good for them. If Jesus were such the Messiah and good, here I am. Blessed is the one who's not offended at me. I don't report to you, John. So the real faithful, hardcore Christian is the one who goes, I get that, and I'm okay with that. I trust him. Because of the blind faith? No. Because you know enough about him to trust him when you don't understand. Period. It's not some blind, dumb faith. It's, I know enough about him. I'll talk about some in the sermon today that he's done so much for us. There comes a point where we go, I get it. He's been so daggum good. Now, there are things I don't have a clue what's going on. And I'm ignorant. The ignorant means I don't have knowledge. I'm ignorant of why he did an X, Y, Z. What I do know is he didn't have to. Because he doesn't report to anybody. He's not breaking rules. He doesn't have them. So before I throw my hands up and give him the bird and despair, no, I'm not doing that. Anyway, I'm going to pause there before we move on because, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. So can't some of the confusion from her earthly father, godly father, come from the model prayer, Matthew 6 and Luke 11, about our Father in heaven? Yes, ma'am. Well, and moreover, all through the Old Testament, that's not true. Not all through. There are a few instances in the Old Testament where God is called God the Father. Absolutely. But there, every scholar would concur, to say Father is to invoke assumptions of God's role as provider, protector, discipliner, teacher, as what a Jewish father would do. Correct. Not a mother who gives birth. Canaanite religions believe that the gods gave birth to people. That's not what they said. No. And so God disciplines us. He trains. He teaches us through the Mosaic Law. He provides and protects for us. Yep. There are similarities in function, but not in moral obligations. Correct. Correct. So people who make that connection, sure, I agree. I agree. That's probably where it comes from because we hear Father and we go, oh, oh, and then it gets worse and worse. Oh, he's my heavenly daddy. And yes, you can translate Abba Daddy if you really want to. I just go because we already got enough problems as it is with the word Father, with people assuming certain false things. It gets real bad in my opinion when they start saying Daddy because I start picturing my daddy. And he would do this for me and this for me, and my good daddy, or the worst, which is my daddy molested me or hurt me. Like, no, 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 he's not your dad, not your dad. There's certain functions that are analogous, and I've already told you what they are: the provider, the protector, educator, discipliner. But that's it. That's it. And in no way does he share the same moral obligations at all. My mom and dad were morally responsible to make sure I had food. God is not morally responsible I have food. He's not my parent. He is not my parent. That's why people starve all over the earth. Why I would never. Good if they're literal kids, but I'm not his literal kid. So that's probably where it might come from. That sure, that misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you for that. Any other question or comment?
So, in essence, you just preached the book of Job very succinctly.
Yeah, there's a degree to which it's like Job, right? Job kind of comes down to God saying, I don't report to you, basically. Yeah, that's right. I don't report to you, and that you can trust me or not, but I don't report to you. I do things you can't fathom. Did you create this being and that being and that? Like I'm in the office of God and you ain't. And so can you trust me? Yeah. Hmm.
It's like that first commandment. God says he's a jealous God. Well, why is he a jealous God? Because he has a right to be.
So why is God says it says in several places God's a jealous God, but why is he jealous? Because he has a right to be. That's right. So metaphor, yeah, he has a right to be because he commanded the Israelites to be faithful to him alone. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so we move on. So when it comes to going through hardships in life, that's where this really hits the road. So as much as you can, if you've been a Christian at least for a while, for sure, if you're Christian at all, Jesus has saved you. There's a little faith there. It is powerful to let God off the hook with your sense of moral superiority. It's powerful to say, you know what, God doesn't report to me. So what am I going to do with that? I mean, really, what am I going to do with that? Do I say, people do this? They go, basically, well, then never mind, I'm not a Christian. If he doesn't report to me and do what I want when he wants to do it, I'm out of here. That's not, I want a genie. I want a cosmic genie. I want a cosmic Santa Claus. I had rules. I was a good girl or boy. He did not give me what I wanted. So forget him. I'm out of here. That's the vast majority of people who left the faith. The other person says, he has done so much for me. I don't understand what's going on, and I trust him. But we all decide. I'm not doing the pastoral counselor. I'm just trying to give you the cold logical response to the theology, the morality behind saying, fine, I'm out of here. Just doesn't make any sense. I understand it's very emotionally powerful. Good heavens, I get it. But don't say you're doing it for rational reasons. Just say that my emotions, I quit the faith because I'm sad. That's it. I left Jesus because I'm mad at him, and he doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. That's his typical response. He doesn't exist, and I'm mad at him. Okay, I'll move ahead. He doesn't report to you or me. Praise God, he doesn't. See, that's gospel. Woo! You want to worship someone who reports to you? Golly, what a puny vision of God. Come here, God. Okay, I'll say this and move on. I love C.S. Lewis. And he has an essay called God in the Dock. And so there's a collection of essays that's called God in the Dock, but that's the name of one of the essays. But it's a great compendium of different chapters and essays of his works. And God in the Dock that covered, anyway, so if you read in the British court system, the defendant stands in something called the dock, is the nickname. So if you're on trial and you're a defendant, you come stand in the dock. And Lewis makes the argument basically forever from the history of time, a guilty person comes and they're the ones who are in the dock, but not for, he says, for the modern man and everything. This is the 40, the man, human. But for the modern man, God is in the dock and we're the judge. So God is always on trial. And I find that absolutely to be the case. That's true. If I talk to the average person on the street, I absolutely assume that if we talk about anything with the Bible, how could God, and God's evil, and he's a barbarian, he's a blah, blah, they immediately, he's on trial. And forever in human history, that was inconceivable because in the office of God, not anymore. Not anymore. Things have really changed. Uh, not in the Christian worldview, but in the average populist view. Okay, can I go ahead? We still got some time. We'll keep playing. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yes, so it reminds us that we're in a fallen world and then bad things happen. We have to live the consequences, good or bad. I, I agree until they're going to say, yeah, okay, why live with the consequences? If God were good, he wouldn't let us suffer the bad consequences. Yeah. So if God intervened every single time something wrong, it'd be chaos. And they're going to say, so when you set the rules for your children and they got really hurt, you wouldn't come to their rescue? Depends on the situation. My response is, there you go. You've just completely misunderstood God. It is irrelevant what I would do as a parent. God's not a parent. I would tell them that's exactly where you're wrong. That's where you're mistaken. God's not our parent. Yes, if my child were in front of me and got hurt and I could help stop it, I'm morally obligated to stop the physical pain, depending on the situation, right? And it is. So if it hurt them when they got a shot at the hospital, I set them up for the suffering because I'm a masochist. No, I know for a fact. Yes, do it again. Again, sir? Do it again. It's empty 4 times. I love it. I was a barbarian. But I have the, yeah, you're welcome. God bless you. And she's turned out so well. But that's right. In general, though, if she's sitting there being hurt on the street, and I go, no, but right, because I'm the parent. God's not her parent. And but right. So there are rules that we have that he put in place, but also moral obligations he simply doesn't have. He doesn't have. No, if you're good, I disagree with you. I disagree with you. I disagree. If a parent is good, then a parent would do X. That is irrelevant. If God was good, no. Now you're assuming good equals following some moral duty. Where did that come from? Where says who? I disagree. So, okay, yes.
I'm backing up just a bit. You said something had changed tremendously, and I want to get a hold of it a little better.
Something that changed tremendously is basically, and certainly in the Western world, in their conception of God, virtually everyone came to God assuming they're a sinner and they've done something wrong, and he's the supreme judge. But for post-enlightenment, the modern man, post 19th century, things have changed. Now we assume we're superior and God reports to us. And so God is on trial. We're not on trial. So there used to be a basic assumption of basic humility that he's God. Even normal pagans or non-Jews, non-Christians still had a degree of, if he were real, but not now. Right now it's, well, he makes the argument basically the modern man. So I'd probably say at least since post-enlightenment. The Enlightenment period changed everything in Europe. And then, of course, it eventually bled over to America. But this idea of humanism is, but maybe after I can tell you more. But I think in general, the Enlightenment changed all that. Yeah. No, good question. Now, is that true for every human being? No. But in general, I do find that to be the case. Having dealt with non-Christians for a long time, that in general, God is a little puny, pathetic, racist, bigot, blah, blah, and it's all dumb. And Roman numeral 7, we talk about moral philosophy. Okay, now we're getting to what some of you are going to, oh, now I know what the morality is, because now we're finally starting to talk about it. But we have been. Okay, moral philosophy. Well, we have things called descriptive ethics and prescriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics, how do people behave? How do they behave? Not how they ought to, just how. So rather than making normative statements, prescriptive statements about what ought to be the case. By the way, they're all taken. Okay. Rather than making normative statements about what ought to be the case or prescribing certain moral behaviors, descriptive ethics focus on observing and explaining actual behaviors and beliefs. For example, they take polls on capital punishment or abortion. even though this doesn't make something moral. What Americans think about abortion, 61% said they're cool with it. Well, that's just descriptive ethics. That's describing what people believe about a certain thing. That's it. So it's not about what ought to be, just what is. An example of descriptive ethics is called psychological egoism. So you have different subcategories. I say this one because this is pretty popular. Psychological egoism makes a descriptive claim about human nature and motivation, asserting that people always act out of self-interest, always. They say it doesn't make it a moral judgment or prescribe that people ought to behave this way. No, no, no. Now, this is not the same as ethical egoism, which says a person should act in their own self-interest. And that's a real deal. That's probably the most popular one there is. But this is just saying that people do act out of self-interest. For example, if someone helps another person because it makes them feel good, that's why they did it. Or they're trying to avoid guilt, that's why they did it. It's still self-interested, even if you have a desire, emotional critique. So if you ask a person, why do people care about morality? Because they do it for their personal reasons. Basically, at heart, they're just a bunch of selfish people. That's all we are. That's usually the response of that descriptive ethic. Well, two major criticisms. Well, human motivations are multifaceted. They're not reduced to self-interest. They can have a mix of motives and actions, genuine care and duty and self-interest. I help the homeless because it makes me feel good and because it's the right thing to do and because the pastor's watching and I want him to think well of me. Not that y'all would do that. I'm just saying. In other words, you can't just say it's only for self-interest. Most people, and that's true, most people do things for multiple motivations. Psychological egoism fails for the Christian because it fails to take into account that not all actions are equally sinful or selfish. People can be transformed in Christ. That's why they do it for selfish reasons. As a Christian, I would say I disagree. Every single action, no, sometimes you do it because it's the right thing to do, because the Spirit motivates you and you go, I'm going to do the right thing, just the right thing. I'm going to let my left hand know what my right hand is doing, because it's just the right thing to do. I'm not trying to get attention, so I don't find that. So I'm going to move on past that one pretty quickly. Prescriptive ethics, or normative, sometimes called that, of course, the opposite of descriptive. This is what should we do? What should we do? It's concerned with prescribing or dictating certain actions, behaviors, or modes of feeling and thinking is right, what we ought to do. A subcategory of prescribed ethics, if you go to school, you'll study something called applied ethics. And that's where you look at specific controversial issues like abortion, infanticide, animal rights, environmental concerns, homosexuality, capital punishment, nuclear war. So some of the subcategory of prescriptive ethics, applied ethics is those. For example, I had a class, my PhD, on bioethics. And that's all we talked about. It was one whole seminar under prescribed ethics and applied ethics of bioethics. And that's all we looked at. So I've got a semester of notes on just pretty much every conceivable issue until that point of ethical issues raised in bioethics. So that include euthanasia, abortion, stem cell research, things like that arise in medicine. You do the same thing with war, and people who are pacifist or just war theory, they focus just on that, like Yoder, who's very well known in pacifism, or you can focus just in sexuality and focus just in on, so people focus on those things. I'm going to pause there. What question or comments do you have about that at all? Anything at all? I'm actually probably going to stop there because I really want to spend time on the next one because it's so common. But any question about prescriptive, normative, what we're talking about? Anything at all? I can repeat some if I need to. Yes, ma'am.
As far as ethics, where does the law come in? Man's law. I mean, a lot of laws I don't believe follow ethics.
Good question. When ethics are involved, where does the law come in? Yeah, that depends on this next big chunk of the study, which is what prescriptive ethics you endorse. So let me if I can just think out loud for a second. There are people who argue that I guess you mean the law the government gives us or the state, right? So governmental or state laws, depending, so whether it's the German government, the Canadian government, whatever, laws of a state, a people group. Yeah, there are people who argue that laws are not moral at all, that they're simply arbitrary laws that the people group decide to make. Others would say some are arbitrary, some are based on ethical issues, some are not based on ethical issues. That is, they might say, for example, and I said this at the very beginning, they would say, for example, which side of the road on which we should drive. It's not an ethical issue. They just said, let's pick one so people don't run into each other all the time. Somebody go, no, there's a deep moral rightness to the right side. Okay, most people don't. They're going to say that's arbitrary, whether they use a pen or pencil or whatever. So someone say it's not moral at all. Someone say there's a conglomeration. That's probably the most people would say some are not moral, some are amoral, and some are moral. But it depends on, you have to unpack all that. Then there are people who say that whether or not, that's how or why they were written. Then other people would say, now, is it a moral issue to disobey them? Do I have the moral duty to obey the state's laws or not? That's a different issue, not how or why the laws are written, but do I need to obey them? And then people disagree on that. Some say, nope, it's not an ethical issue at all. It's just an issue of citizenship. It's not a moral issue if I'm a criminal. It's just I broke their law. That's not moral or immoral. Others will say, yes, it is. Christians historically have said, yes, it is immoral to violate the laws of the state. Historically, from a typical reading of Romans 13. I don't find that very persuasive, but that's a different issue. Maybe sometime we talk about that. I find that kind of persuasive, but not fully.
One of my biggest problems now are the laws of euthanasia. I mean,
The laws of euthanasia, correct?
abortion.
And abortion, right. So most moral thinkers would say those are clear moral issues. That's right. Most would say that, and most would say, therefore, the state needs to get it right on these moral issues. And that's why most government officials will concur with that, too. They bring in professional ethicists to talk about all those things before they make a decision on a law. Because they would say, this is not arbitrary. These are real ethical, serious. AI, artificial intelligence, that's a big thing. They're having meeting after meeting. They're forming whole groups of specialists to discuss the morality of AI. It's going to take over everything. And so they're deciding now what to do with it. Stem cell research, on cloning. Yeah, most people agree those are ethical issues. Yeah, that's how to write the laws. It's another issue whether I have to obey those laws, whether that's ethical. Whether you should be public or, that's right. That's right. Christians historically have said, that what the state says you need to obey, unless it violates the teaching of Jesus. You do? Good for you. Oh, they do violate, right. Sometimes they do violate the teaching of Jesus, right. Well, that's right. We got 3 seconds, 4 seconds. So God bless you. Hope to see you next time. Come back tomorrow.